So I will try and be quite short and just try and illustrate some of the key issues that seem to me to be at stake in the biopolitics of our present. And then we'll see if there's energy to take up any of the things in more detail in question time. And forgive me for speaking in English. I will try and speak quite slowly. And the PowerPoint slides are probably more use to me than they are to you. Forgive me for that. So, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, the very term biopolitics is a highly contested one. And it ranges from very expansive ideas in which anything which has to do with the management of human life, human labor, human existence becomes termed biopolitics. I myself take a rather more restricted view of the term, and one that's more amenable to empirical investigations. So when I'm talking about biopolitics, I'm talking about contests over the ways in which aspects of human vitality, morbidity, and mortality, how those should be problematized, which forms of knowledge, which types of authority, which practices of intervention are appropriate. And very schematically, when I worked with Paul Rabenauer on these issues, we suggested that you should look at these things along 3 dimensions, and of course you'll recognize 3 dimensions from the work of Michel Foucault: the dimension of truth, the emergence of certain and transformation of certain truth discourses about human beings, and authorities who are capable of speaking that truth, the emergence of certain strategies for intervention on individual or collective existence in the name of life or in the name of health, and the emergence and transformation of certain modes of subjectification. And of course, all those ways of thinking about human life individually and collectively are shaped and entwined with more general regimes of political power, more general ways of thinking about and trying to activate the conduct of individual and collective conduct. So I think it's necessary to begin, as indeed some colleagues this afternoon have already been very clear about, that what we mean by medicine these days has transformed. At one time, maybe our priests and our poets were engineers of the human soul. Indeed, the term engineers of the human soul was, I think, first used by Joseph Stalin, talking about poets in the Soviet Union. He said, "You poets, you are the engineers of the human soul." Anyhow, medics, up until quite recently, had very limited capacities to cater to the afflictions of the human body. And in the 20th century, we saw the emergence of the psychologists who understood us better than we did ourselves. And also over the 20th century, doctors, medics acquired and were accorded hugely advanced capacities to diagnose ailments and administer cures. And the situation in which we find ourselves today, in which medicine or biomedicine is a sprawling complex for managing a whole multitude of aspects of human and indeed of non-human vitality in the name of many, many different values: personal values, collective values, national values, economic values, and so on, socio-economic values. That is to say, medicine is about and inextricably intertwined with the politics of life itself. And we know that this is a profoundly ethical endeavor, in that our ethics have been shaped, ethics in the sense of the management of our subjectivity, has been shaped very fundamentally by the emergence of these new biomedical regimes. And as many colleagues have already spoken about this afternoon, we see a whole range of truths about ourselves articulated in the language of biology and biomedicine. So I think we've moved to a situation, to move to the end of the argument, in which our vitality, whether it's our somatic vitality, whether it's our cerebral or neural vitality, is increasingly seen as amenable to engineering in the service of human hopes and human desires. And we've seen this not just at the individual level or at the level of certain types of expertise, but we've seen huge investments in biomedical sciences in the name of certainly what's called in Europe grand social challenges. So if you live in Europe these days, you see everywhere in all the funding agencies this language of grand social challenges. They're food security, they're energy security, they're the burden of disease, they're the increasing burden of the aged. And biomedical science is at least one of the key domains which is being invested in to address those, quote, grand social challenges. And in addressing those grand social challenges, we've seen radical transformations in the relationship between scientific research in the academy, research done in private and quasi-private institutions for profit, and research which is done specifically in relation to the transformation of market relations. So the question is about the new configurations of truth, power, and ethics that are taking shape, the new relationships between the government of each and the government of all. If we were going to characterize the biopolitics of the 21st century, then it seems to me that those would be the great questions which we would try and answer, which I'm sure you're delighted to hear I'm not going to attempt to answer in the next 20 or 25 minutes, but maybe I will just try and give a few little clues as to the way in which I'm thinking about it, and in the course of doing so, I'll maybe have a few words to say about this word control that people have been using quite a lot this afternoon, and maybe a little bit to say about this word neoliberalism that some of you have been using this afternoon. Neoliberalism, I know, is a very powerful analytical term or descriptive term here in Latin America, but I'm not the only one who begins to wonder whether or not it is such an expansive term that it is beginning to lose its capacity to inspire critical thought about what's really going on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about control. I'm going to talk a little bit about bodies and souls. I'm going to talk a little bit about biocapital. It's the time to finish already. And then I'm going to talk about somatic ethics. And is this working? This thing working? Just bear with me a second whilst I get my own little clicker out, because I just wanted to tell you who those guys were, who are on the screen here, if you can even see them. Okay, so this character here, this is Ian Wilmot, the person who cloned Dolly the sheep. This is Francis O. Schmidt, the inventor of the term neuroscience. This is Henry Markram, the leader of the Human Brain Project. I have to confess a commercial interest, or rather a financial one, in that part of my work is funded by the Human Brain Project. This gentleman here is Craig Venter, who some of you will know was the leader of the commercial endeavor to sequence the human genome, and later, more recently, has been very active in synthetic biology. This gentleman down here you probably won't know. He's a good friend of mine. He's Yang Huangming, who founded the biggest genomic institute in the world, formerly the Beijing Genomic Institute, now the BGI in Shenzhen. Oh, I should also declare an interest, because I'm an ethics advisor, amusingly enough, to the BGI. And this gentleman here, where you'll probably all recognize him, that is Gilles Deleuze. So why do I put all those guys together? I'm sorry they are all guys, but that's what they are, they're guys. let's talk a little bit about control. So I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this now very famous argument from Gilles Deleuze about the nature of control in this tiny little piece that he wrote, but very prescient piece, unusually for Deleuze, really intelligible. You do not have to be a great expert in Deleuzian philosophy to understand this piece. And here's what Deleuze said. That is Deleuze, that's where it was published, L'Autre Journal. We are in a generalized crisis in relation to all the environments of enclosure, prisons, hospitals, etc., etc., etc. All those disciplinary institutions, he said. Everybody knows they're finished. It's only a matter of administering their last rites. Actually, he was rather wrong about this because we do have still a lot of those institutions of enclosure. The camp is not disappeared. But he says, and this is where I want to emphasize, he says we are moving towards what he calls societies of control. Control is the term for the ultra-rapid forms of free-floating control that replace the old disciplines. And then he goes on to talk about how pharmaceuticals, genomics, molecular engineering, etc., is all part of that. That's really rather prescient, actually, of Deleuze to have named all those. But that's not really my point. My point is, what did he mean by control? And he did not mean what we, certainly those of us who are sociologists, think of as social control. That is, imposing a fixed set of norms upon individuals in the interests of authorities, political regime or whatever. That is not what Deleuze meant by control. In fact, what he meant was, in a sense, quite the opposite of that, and quite the opposite of what discipline did, because it was not the once and for all shaping of habits and consciousness. It was not a single standard of the norm against which everybody was judged. It was not creating disciplined individuals that had particular kinds of characteristics. It was about creating what he called dividuals with an array of distinct and divisible elements, and those dividuals were constantly plugged into mobile circuits which modulated their conduct in particular kinds of ways. So there were multiple dispersed points of inclusion and exclusion in which conduct was constantly being modulated in relation to a range of transforming kinds of objectives. So control, I think, in this sense, has to be understood as something different from discipline, of course, but something different from social control. All right. So the second part, which I just want to talk about very briefly, is what's happening to our idea of life. And I stress our idea of life because I want to come back at the end to talk about some problems with that. So I suppose the central point, again, to put it in a little cliche, is that our idea of life has moved from life as mystery to life as mechanism. Life as, in principle, living organisms, as, in principle, amenable to reverse engineering, to understanding how they function at the molecular level, and by molecular, that's a bit of a sort of metaphor, really, how they function at their biophysical level, how they function at their chemical level, how they function at their electrical level, how they function in terms of the specific components, very specifiable, anatomizable components that make them up. So life is envisaged now as in some way or other emerging, not from some élan vital, not from something which is mysterious, but something which in principle happens as a result of very specific and identifiable and therefore manageable physical properties, knowable and manageable physical properties. And once life is envisaged in that way, once vitality is envisaged as emerging out of those properties that can be understood, that can be reverse engineered, then can be intervened in and transformed, life or vitality becomes available, excuse the excuse the reference for those of you who know the reference, it becomes available as a standing resource, a technical resource which can be instrumentalized, engineered, capitalized at will. Now, we know that that is not a complete fantasy, because we know that we have seen the emergence of some kinds of technologies that appear to have that capacity to engineer and re-engineer life in a way that would be surprising, would have been surprising to me when I went to university to study my fruit flies. So here are just some of the examples. The first womb transplant baby, the woman who's had the first face transplant. Here is a girl from Scotland, Hayley, who's not only had a new hand, but she's had her hand printed using 3D printing. You know, here are the drugs. Here's a decade of the love drug. We had a discussion earlier on about poppers and things like that. We didn't mention Viagra. Maybe it's only at my time of life that Viagra becomes the equivalent, or at least in the same frame as the popper. Let's not even go there. And here, and this is why I mentioned Craig Venter, this is Craig Venter appearing to put the final nail in the coffin of vitalism. And indeed, when this piece of research was published, often you saw the comments in Nature and in Science, this is the nail in the coffin of vitalism. This is Craig Venter's, using synthetic biology techniques, creation of what he hated to be called, but is usually called Cynthia. It's a mycoplasma. It's a bacterium found in the genitalia of military personnel often, but he's chosen this as his experimental animal. And what Craig Venter did was that he sequenced the whole genome of the mycoplasma. He took out the original, he sequenced it from sugar bases, the C's, A's, G's and T's. He sequenced them from sugar bases. He compiled them together to mimic the sequence that was in the original organism. He threw out various things. So if you know anything about genetics, you know that the genetics of most organisms has lots of repetitions in it. It has lots of junk in it that doesn't seem to be doing anything. Well, they chucked out the repetitions. They chucked out the junk. They put in a little watermark so that they could see that it was indeed the DNA sequence that Craig had produced rather than the DNA sequence that evolution or God had produced. And they put this back into the bug and they booted it up, and lo and behold, the bug was alive. Craig Venter creates life from 4 sugar bases. Now, of course, that is a little bit of a fantasy, because what he didn't do was make the cell membrane. What he didn't do was make the protoplasm. He just did a bit of very fancy, extremely fancy genetic engineering. Today, that appears to show that by modifying mechanism, you can create living organisms. And these days, moving from these very, very simple bugs to a more complicated bug, which is yeast, there's a big endeavor, a very interesting endeavor, to do exactly the same in the yeast chromosome. The yeast has got 18 different chromosomes. These chromosomes have been allocated to different labs. Each lab is trying to synthesize the chromosome. Again, throw away the deletions, throw away the repetitions, stick it back into the bug. Lo and behold, you've got yeast. You still haven't made the cell wall, but it looks as if from these 4 sugar bases that create the 4 bases of deoxyribonucleic acid, which are the 4 bases that form the double helix of the DNA. You can create those out of sugar, and you can create life itself. From the body of the bug to the brain, well, those of you who've been to my other presentations won't want me to go on about this in great detail. The argument that the brain has become anatomized in exactly the same way, an organ like any other, no longer mystery, but mechanism, something that is open to molecular knowledge and molecular intervention, amenable by intervention either by drugs, by the chemical route, I'll say a little bit about that later on, psychopharmacology, enhancement type drugs, maybe even the poppers and the whatever. Did they do anything to the brain? I don't know, but they appear to do things to other parts of the body. But increasingly, because of the failure of the drugs to do what the drugs were claimed to do, intervention by other means into the brain. So I work, as you know, with the Human Brain Project, so we're quite interested in some of these interventions in the brain. I was also, for 6 years, on the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and we published a report on novel neurotechnologies. Novel neurotechnologies, by which I mean technologies that go straight into the brain, not using the chemical route, and seek to modulate the capacities of the brain, or, in the words of this, which you cannot see here, unfortunately, that little box there is headed, "Build yourself a better brain." Build a better brain, and it uses all these kinds of technologies to indicate the way in which the brain itself is becoming open to calculated intervention. The brain-computer interfaces that enable thought to be read directly out of the brain through a cortical implant in the brain, initially with a monkey that some of you saw yesterday, if it was yesterday. The implant was actually in the motor cortex of the brain, so this was a slightly distantiated move, thought, then the monkey thought it was moving, and when it thought it was moving, a small number of cells were activated in its motor cortex. Those cells could be read out. They moved the prosthetic arm in more elegant ways and modern ways of doing it, going straight to the thought itself, not using the motor cortex. This is deep brain stimulation, which is increasingly used for the treatment of Parkinson's disease and other diseases of movement, disorders of movement, but is now also being argued to be used for intractable depression. This is transcranial magnetic stimulation. Well, you can buy these on the web if you like, and try and change your cortical function by putting a magnet close to your brain. These are neural stem cells. Well, I mentioned Ian Wilmot. Forgive me, colleagues, it's been a busy 3 days, and I can't actually remember what I've said to some of you before and what I haven't said to some of you before. So if I'm repeating myself, just put it down to the fact that I'm old and tired. This is the book, the ghost biography of Ian Wilmot. It was called The Second Creation, Dolly and the Age of Biological Control. And this is what Ian Wilmot says. Until the birth of Dolly, scientists were apt to declare that this or that procedure would be biologically impossible, but by now that expression, biologically impossible, seems to have lost all meaning. In the 21st century and beyond, human ambition will be bound only by the laws of physics, the rule of logic, and our descendants' own sense of right and wrong. Truly, Dolly has taken us into the age of biological control. We can no longer assume that the biological itself will impose limits on human ambitions. Humanity must accept much greater responsibility towards the realm of the biological, which has become a wholly contingent condition. What we're given by nature, by evolution, or by God, if you want to think that way, we can transform by will to do what we want to do. This is the cover of Newsweek when that experiment with Cynthia was published, and here is J.C. Venter. He playing God. Is he playing God? And my dear friend Yang Hua Ming, in a presentation I heard him give a while ago, said, well, actually we know that it's true that the meaning of life is 42. For those of you who used to see the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if that ever came to Chile, will know that the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, was 42. Well, Yang Hua Ming said it was indeed 42. What's 42? It's the 4 sugar bases, C, A, G, and T, and it's the zeros and ones of binary logic. If you have 4 sugar bases and the zeros and ones, you can do what you like. Now, of course, a lot of this is hubris. It's pride. much remains biologically impossible. In fact, when I talked about this Ian Wilmot to a very good friend of mine, Jack Price, who works at King's College. He works with neurostem cells. He works on therapies for people who've had big brain lesions because of stroke. He was so outraged by this idea that nothing was biologically impossible that he wrote a piece for my journal saying much, of course, remains biologically impossible. There's much that we do not know how to do, but the dream is there, the belief is there, that it is only our ingenuity, it's only the limits of our current scientific research that prevents us from doing what we want to vital organisms. Vital organisms are engineerable apparatuses. We don't need any vitalism. And if we don't need any vitalism and we can engineer ourselves at will, then these ideas of the normal and the pathological start to become very, very, very blurry. What's the normal lifespan? Is there a normal lifespan anymore? My grandparents at my age would, fortunately for them, they'd be sitting at home putting their feet up, having the odd glass of sherry now and settling in front of the television. They certainly wouldn't be sitting in front of you guys here in Santiago giving a lecture. What's normal reproduction? If you can have a womb transplant, or you can take Viagra, or you can do one of the anythings, what's normal anything? What's normal reproduction? What's the difference between cure, between normalization, between modulation, manipulation, optimization? These divisions, the normal and the pathological, so fundamental to some of our historical epistemologists, seem to have become inappropriate. We are living, therefore, in this dream in an age of control over our biology. In this dream, we've moved away from norm and normalization to multiplicity and modulation. And this is, I think, what Deleuze was trying to get at quite presciently in his idea of control. Control designed into the flows of everyday existence. If we see something that is problematic, we no longer, at least in this dream, seek to exclude it, seek to eliminate it, seek to send it off to the gas chambers, or seek to remove it by eugenic means. We seek to include it by modulating it. Biology has become highly, highly optimistic. When I started my work on the book called The Politics of Life Itself, the general view was that there was a rise of new biological politics, and it was becoming very fatalistic. We'd have a knowledge of the future without the possibility of altering it. We'd be back into an age where genetics and biology prescribed a fixed hierarchy of capacities. And we all went off and saw Gattaca, and we thought that was going to be our future. But actually, that's not our future, because the more biological it is, the more things are open to change, and the more we see again and again new forms of collectivization which are seeking to take that change into their own hands. Biology, not destiny, but opportunity. Biology that becomes our responsibility individually and collectively to control. Biology where there are new forms of collectivity, like patients like us being the sort of classic one, where patients get together, they compare their symptoms, they analyze the effects of different kinds of drugs, they share that knowledge, and in some cases they go on to try and develop their own cures and to get intellectual property in their own kinds of therapeutic intervention. So what I can't do now, but what I would suggest we need to do if we're thinking of the biopolitics of the 21st century, is try and understand the new relations of authority, the new roles of knowledge, the new roles of collectivity, the new relations between patients and experts that are taking shape in these new configurations. In the Deleuzian piece that I mentioned, Deleuze is not wholly dismissive of these new developments that he is describing. He says, in of course Deleuzian rather hyperbolic terms, we need to analyze the dynamics of liberation and enslavement that are within each of them. And however much that is a hyperbolic phrase, liberation and enslavement, they make things possible for us to do to ourselves at the very same moment as they limit the things that we can do to ourselves in certain kinds of ways. I'm thinking a little bit of what Sebastian was talking about a little bit earlier on, about ADHD, or the arguments that were made about the teaching of social skills. Okay, they increase the capacity of people to control certain aspects of their existence at the cost of shaping their existence within certain limits. So the dialectic of liberation and enslavement is very much part of all these kinds of things. Okay, let's forget about all that. Do I want to talk about this? No, I don't. I suggested that what we needed to think about here were the relationships. You know, there's that famous paper by Michel Foucault. What is it called? Omnes et singulatum. Omnes et singulatum. Each and all. What's happening for each and what's happening for all. And we see these types of control being taken up in the name of each and in the name of all. In the name of each, well, here are some, I don't know if the Angelina Jolie effect had its sort of, sorry, I know yesterday I was talking about Jennifer Aniston, now I'm talking about Angelina Jolie. Forgive me, that's the limits of my knowledge of popular culture, but there you go. The Angelina Jolie effect. Here's someone who makes use of these new forms of knowledge in order to transform her own future, takes her own future into her own hands. And here are a number of other illustrations of people trying, wishing to take their own future into their own hands. For each, should I take the statins to control my high lipid levels? That's for me. Should I take the life-extending drugs, even though it costs £50,000 to extend my life by an average of 3 years? That's for me. If I'm not given compensation, do I deserve that? For me. So in part, it's for each. And in part, it's for all. And another part of this talk, if I had another hour or so to talk, which I clearly don't, I would talk about at least one example of this, which is the use of very intense data mining of huge amounts of biological and lifestyle data in order to identify the genetic and biological markers of disease, in order not just to diagnose the disease more accurately, but to intervene early in a preventive way. Now, why is there all this excitement about precision medicine? Why did President Obama about a month ago launch the American Precision Medicine Initiative? Why did China about 3 weeks ago launch its Precision Medicine Initiative? For each of you, yes, the precision medicine, what this means is putting hundreds and thousands, indeed millions of whole genome sequences up into the cloud in China, into the Alibaba cloud, Alibaba being the equivalent in China of Amazon in the West. Putting all these into the cloud, linking it up with clinical data, linking it up with lifestyle data, linking it up with the history of your disease and when you die, linking it up with your Fitbit data or your Apple Watch data, mining that data to find algorithms, and then when you go into your doctor's surgery, your doctor will ideally take a little cheek swab. He'll put the cheek swab into a machine. He'll say, would you go and wait in the waiting room for 20 minutes? He'll call you back in after 20 minutes. He'll have compared your DNA sequence and all the other data that he has about your lifestyle and so on with millions and millions and millions of people like you. And he will say, in the way in which Amazon does, well, people like you often responded well to this kind of drug. Or people like you sadly died within the last 3 months, so put your affairs in order. Ideally the first, because we will find out what happens with the drugs, ideally not the second. Why is there this excitement? One of the colleagues earlier on spoke about the 80 diseases that were in the Chilean inventory of the diseases that could be recompensed, and said, well, look, it's quite surprising, isn't it, that once a disease gets to be recompensed, there's much, much, much more of it. So when they founded the UK, the British National Health Service, in the 1940s, the dream was that after a while the British population would be so fit that the demand for medicine would really go down. But of course, exactly the reverse has happened. The demand for medical care has gone up and up and up. Population is living older and older and older. Everyone is calculating the burden of disease. What is the burden of disease? Pretty soon the burden of disease will become an unbearable burden for most healthcare systems. How are we going to deal with the burden of disease, of age, of the dementias, etc., 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 without destroying the very economic systems which depend upon the vital labour of the population? Well, perhaps this kind of... So this is the for all bit. For each, yes, your precision medicine, but for all, please, 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 can we find a way of coping with the burden of disease? Right, well, longer than I had anticipated. A few words about biocapital. I said at the beginning that you needed to understand changes in, well, not you needed to, but it might be helpful, handy, useful, analytically appropriate to understand changes in biopolitics by placing them within a much more general transformation in political rationalities and governmental technologies. The changes that you here have so frequently called neoliberalism. Now, why I don't like the term neoliberalism is, A, what you're seeing has almost nothing to do with the articulated positions of anybody who would call themselves a neoliberal. In fact, everybody denies that they're neoliberals these days, so we're calling them neoliberal. B, because many of these changes were argued for by politicians of left, right, and centre earlier, before neoliberalism became so familiar, and C, because many of the things that, and we had this discussion a little bit early on about the autonomous, responsible, choosing individual, taking control of their life and treating themselves as a kind of entrepreneur of themselves. Well, we saw that developing in the 1970s and the 1980s, at least in Europe. So the elements that are put together today seem to be a little bit more hybrid, to use that term. There's a debate about whether or not it's sensible to think of that hybrid configuration as neoliberal, as many do, or to try and break it down into a series of rather complex and not necessarily interrelated governmental rationalities and technologies, as I do. I'm not even going to go into that debate now, but these will be unbelievably familiar to you. What do we mean by these transformations? It's not the withdrawal of the state, it's the emergence of new technologies for managing individual and collective conduct. It's the transformation of a whole series of regimes, education being one, medicine being another, insurance, social insurance being another, into quasi-markets. Turning things that were not markets into quasi-markets and trying to make people calculate in those quasi-markets as if they were managing commodities in a quasi-market, for instance, the creation of a market in bodily components. It's the marketization of previously state-managed authorities. It's a situation in which the state says, we can no longer provide you with, as they used to say in the UK, security from cradle to grave. It's simply impossible. If we were to do it, it would require an extension of state power that you would find unbearable, and it would require an economic cost that would be unmanageable. So there are things that can no longer and should no longer and could no longer be managed by the state, and unfortunately, guys, you've got to take a bit of control over those from yourself. This is part of the emergence of the idea of resilience, which is again a double-faced kind of ideas, etc., etc., etc. So, again, to understand biopolitics in the 21st century, which I'm not going to try and do now, you need to try and place it within those more general transformations, it seems to me. Of course, we can see very easily some elements that seem to fit into that. So the marketization of vital components, the fact that a kidney, a sperm, an egg, any part of the body now is able to be commodified, to be transformed into a market. You can get intellectual property in your little bugs if you are in synthetic biology. Almost every scientist I talk to across the world has IP in at least intellectual property in at least one or two of their inventions. There's the commodification of vitality itself, and there's a huge expansion of medicine, not just pharmaceuticals, but also the medical device industry, which is becoming really, really hugely important at an age when we're all, well, no, you guys because you're so young, but as people get old, they're decaying, they need new hips, new arms, new elbows, new whatever, and each of these is produced as a commodity in a market by Medtronics, by Johnson & Johnson, 3 or 4 massive great multinational corporations that dominate the medical device industry, actually which engage in hugely expensive intellectual property patent litigation against one another, which snaffle the inventions made by some doctor down in some bit of Texas, and when the doctor says, oh, you snaffled my invention, they say, right, well, have $2 billion. Is that going to keep you quiet? Now we'll use our invention. The sums that are used to settle some of these medical device litigations are absolutely stupendous, and I mention this only to indicate that there is a vast market out there in illness and health. Vitality has become commoditized, commercialized, marketized, and that marketization involves both the public and the private sector. It's difficult to tell the difference between them. So we see an extraction of the surplus inherent in vitality and it's extractable to the extent that vitality has become a kind of mechanism that's manipulable and commoditable. Enough of this, time to move to an end. I've argued elsewhere that these developments are transforming our ways of managing ourselves. I'm not going to say very much about that because you've heard a lot about that this afternoon. If we think of ethics as Lebensführung, as the way in which we manage and steer ourselves through our lives, the ways in which we think about what's valuable, about what we could, should, and must do for ourselves, what we can do, what we can hope for, what we can manage, what we should aspire to. If we think about all those things, it's now pretty impossible to think about those things without our ways of thinking being infused by the fears and hopes and knowledges and judgments are given to us by medicine. And therefore it's impossible for us to think about those without a relationship, a new kind of relationship with the authorities who speak the truth about that. Angelina Jolie decides to have a double mastectomy in order to save her life on the basis of her relationship with a probabilistic assessment made by certain kinds of medical authorities about the likelihood of her developing breast cancer and other kinds of cancer. That's perhaps one of the most poignant examples, but you see this again and again and again and again emerging in the screening technologies that are beginning to become so sort of pervasive in our society. So yes, bioscience is transforming what it is to be human. It is opening this idea of bodies and souls as amenable to engineering. It's not a matter of biological reductionism, but of placing on our agendas a series of biological possibilities, and in a sense, not choosing is itself a choice. So in some of the great feminist work earlier on amniocentesis for women in pregnancy to see whether or not their fetus was had a major chromosomal disorder, a trisomy that might lead to Down syndrome, not having the test was just as much of a choice as having the test, and not having the test and then having a child that did have a major chromosomal disorder opened you up to all sorts of charges of irresponsibility. Indeed, some of you may know, I don't know if they've come here, those heart-rending cases where children with genetic abnormalities sue their parents in the court for wrongful birth or for wrongful life. wrongful birth, but if they haven't had the test, the wrongful birth or wrongful life, I forget which way around it is now. Wrongful life, I think, is where the child sues the parent and the doctor on the grounds that it would be better for that child never to have been born at all, that it doesn't live a life worthy of life. To that chilling phrase, which those of you who know the history of eugenics goes back to Germany in the early 20th century, Bindung und Hochsbuch, a life not worthy of life. Of course, the children sue the parents to get money from the insurance companies to pay for the cost of their care, but nonetheless, something is shown there. No one is normal. We can't tell the difference between therapy and enhancement. We live in this world of hope. So then the question arises, and this is, I'm coming belatedly to my close here, the question arises of how we should relate to this new complex of truth and power, which is reshaping our very sense of what it is to be human, which is apparently giving us the capacity to modulate ourselves at will. Are we in this age of biological control, where nothing is biologically impossible? Well, it's a dream. Whether it's a dream or a reality, it is a radical challenge to any naturalism of the human. Were we, if I was Bruno Latour, I would say, were we ever natural? Was the human ever natural? Well, the answer is almost certainly no. Would we ever want to be natural? In my view, most of us in this room would be sick, dying, or dead if we were natural. We've been hybridizing ourselves, manipulating ourselves ever since humans became human. So one way or another, the dream of nature is a dream long, long past its sell-by date. And one way or another, we're faced with ethical questions, socio-ethical questions, which are way, way beyond what's dreamed of in bioethics. Bioethics, especially individualized US bioethics. Should I or should I not turn off the life support machine when millions of kids are dying under the age of 5 for want of, $1 a day or something like that? Should I turn off the life support machine? That's the wrong kind of ethics. But there is a right kind of ethics which says, what kinds of human beings do we want to be? Do we want to be? And yet, before we even think about that, we need to realize that although, as I've sort of indicated in this very rapid tour, there are many things that seem to confirm that human and other vital organisms are manipulable, we know that it's not as simple as that. There are many, many challenges to the idea that you can manipulate life at the molecular level. I know your project here on psychopharmacology. Psychopharmacology, as I think I've said before, millions and millions of our fellow citizens are taking the drugs. As my friend David Healy says in his charming Irish accent, the drugs don't do nothing, but the drugs don't do what they say on the tin, and most of the drugs don't work in the way in which they say they're going to work, especially the drugs for treating mental distress. Although I've said that it looks as if we can manipulate things at the molecular level, we know that there are many, many, many stages of emergence and complexity between the molecule and the organism. And if I talk about my work on the Human Brain Project, we know that we simply do not know how to move up the levels from what we've understood about organisms from the wonderfully productive reductionism of scientific research, to move up the levels to understand how complex organisms work. We know something, but we don't know everything. We know, if we think about organisms, that the organism is more than the sum of its parts. The great founder of experimental medicine, Claude Bernard, says somewhere something like, if we separate out the organism into a series of parts in our experiment, it's only because that's the thing that we can experiment on, and we should never forget that the living organism is a whole, vital organism shaped over time from the moment of conception onwards in its relationship with its milieu. And it's much more than simply a sort of reading out of a genetic program, as people thought at the beginning of the Human Genome Project. So we need to recognize that in part that idea of biological control, of manipulation, is a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that has consequences. It's an imaginary which is real in its effects, as my old hero Louis Althusser might have put it. So I think the question is how we should respond, we in the social and the human sciences, to those developments which I've sketched out in the most, even taking twice as long as I had intended, in the most sort of rudimentary kind of way, to this imagined biopolitics of control where life appears as a standing reserve to be bent to human will under the management of certain authorities. Should we stand against this? Should we stand in favor of nature? Should we stand in favor of leaving the human, of not being subject to all these biomedical and biological interventions? Should we hope that maybe something nicer, maybe psychology is a bit better than biology? Well, those of us who've done the history of psychology would not be so certain that psychology was that nicer, that much nicer. Or should we perhaps embrace the possibilities, just the possibilities, that another politics of life is possible, and that perhaps through working in relation to these kinds of biomedical practices, in transforming them to our ends rather than to other people's ends, something a little better might emerge. And with real apologies for gabbling on in English, 50 minutes at the end of a very long day, I'm going to stop there.